And we are live here in the Storycraft Cafe. I am your story barista, Hank Garner. It's kind of a joke that
I'll have a tall half calf decaf latte, please.
oh, full calf for me, please. I'm just gonna go ahead and apologize up front here. I'm gonna be sucking on cough drops as we do this because this morning here in the dirty South, where Rick is a native but is now an expat from, um, your weather decided to seep down here, and it's a frigid 50 degrees this morning, and it's got
Oh my
my
gosh.
sinuses. I know to the burr. Oh, with my guest and friend Rick Partlow is here. We did this a couple of months ago, and StreamYard, the platform that we're using here, just decided to go out to lunch and completely lost our recording. So Rick was gracious enough to come back and revisit us again.
Hopefully
Rick,
it'll work this time, knock on
yeah,
wood.
absolutely, absolutely, and we have some folks joining us live, so welcome in. Rick is one of the most prolific authors that I've ever met, and Rick, from the numerous times that we've chatted, there's no magic to doing what you do and putting out the kind of work that you do. It's butt in chair, hand on keyboard, consistently showing up to do the work. How many releases do you have now? And I say that, let me quantify that. Right now, you have four books that are up for pre-order on Amazon. One of them coming out next week, and then three others from November, December, and March, if I'm remembering right. So the machine is still full steam ahead, right?
It's hard to say that with any certainty because I had a bunch of books that I self published in my backlist that I have signed over to Athon Books to relaunch. So there's about 7 books still that they haven't relaunched yet that were previously published that they're going to put new covers on, new editing, and
Yeah.
3 of them they'll make audiobooks out of. Um, so the books that I have completed, uh, I've written 57 that have been published, but 7 of them, if you count the one that's coming out next Tuesday, there's still 7 of them. No, wait, 9 of them that haven't been published yet.
Wow.
Because I have 2 new ones that still have to come out that are already finished.
So what like your the book that you're writing right now, because I know you're always writing on a book, and you're constantly posting on Facebook, like 50,000 words in Drop Trooper number 84. um
Mm.
you
I
know
wish it was
and
84 already.
yeah, that's a little joke. But that's it's a big motivator for a lot of people in the writing community, because they're like, man, Rick is grinding out the words. With the book that you're writing right now, where will it fall in your publishing calendar?
Well, it's the book I'm writing right now is Drop Trooper Book 11. Um, it is scheduled for release way later than it's actually going to be released. See, it's scheduled to be released March 21st, but I'm going to have it finished by the end of October. So I'm thinking it'll probably go out sometime in December.
Wow. um you talked about taking some of the books in your back catalog, and like Athon is repurposing some of those stories, republishing, putting new
Yeah,
covers on, and kind of
relaunching them. Yeah.
freshening up the marketing. That's an interesting thing about fiction, is that for the most part, and I'm going to quantify that because, or qualify that, because I'm sure there's um, an argument against it, but for the most part, fiction has a pretty long shelf life. There's some nonfiction that doesn't always age well. Um, like 2,000 reasons that the rapture is going to happen in the year 2000 probably didn't age well, 22 years after. But fiction, for the
Thank
most
God, my father was a Baptist preacher, so the rapture has been going to happen every year since the mid '70s for me.
right, right, exactly. Yeah, I grew up in that as well, and yeah, yeah. Um, but fiction can have a much longer shelf life, and I know a lot of authors that are kind of republishing some of their work from 20 years ago, 10 years ago, and you can put a new cover on it, and update your blurbs and stuff, and it can find a whole new audience, especially futuristic sci-fi, that we're not in any danger of running up on, and the tech becoming, obsolete or something,
That's already
Um,
happened to me a couple of
yeah.
times.
Well, what are some of the dangers of writing sci-fi and having things, maybe not evolve the way that you
Well,
dreamed that they would?
I have a perfect example of that.
Okay.
The first series that I ever wrote, Duty, Honor, Planet,
Yep.
still I still consider it some of my best stuff. But
Yeah.
it originally was based when I finished about half of that book, maybe a little more than half,
Yeah.
uh, back in the late '80s when I was in college. I was handwriting it in a 3-ring binder with college ruled paper, and it wound up being accidentally thrown out, and which was a good thing because it was based on a resolution of the Cold War that wound up being made false a year after I
Oof.
lost it. So it it it, it had like a remnant of the Soviet Union still around. So I had to rewrite it anyway. And it's funny because I rewrote it in the mid '90s, and one of the main antagonists um, is a Russian like wannabe dictator who's not communist but is more just a dictator, and he's very very similar to Putin. I'd never heard of Putin at the time. Putin was just a KGB agent or an FSB agent back then, so I had no idea who Putin was. But I had a character very much like Putin being in charge of Russia uh, when there was at the time of a nuclear war with China, and the Chinese premier or whatever was a very uh, xenophobic and autocratic type that is very similar in many ways to Z. So
Some
but
things work out, some things.
so it worked out that I had to rewrite that book. But also, there are some technical innovations that I posited from reading things like Aviation Week and Space Technology, reading the nonfiction articles, I guess, in things like Jerry Pournelle's There Will Be War anthology, where he talked about. I mean, I hated reading the short stories in those anthologies. I wanted the nonfiction part where they speculated about future weapon system. So I came up with a bunch of stuff that seemed very futuristic when I started writing these books in the late '80s, and now, not that long after they've been released, they're still out. All this stuff has happened already. Not 100 years from now, but now. So that's one of the other dangers is if you stay in the business long enough, things that you predicted happening farther in the future happen now, and
Right, right.
people's like, oh, he's just has stuff in his universe 200 years from now that they already have in the military.
Well, speaking of that, uh, a lot of fiction, I would dare say almost all fiction, is in some way a way for the writer to make sense of the world around him or her, by creating allegories. Or allegory is not a good word always, but fictionalizing the things that we're all going through, and finding ways to kind of play out the what if game, if you will, or to postulate how the future might go. Um, is there a danger in doing that sort of thing with science fiction, of pontificating too much, or kind of what's the role of a science fiction author in kind of trying to make sense of the world around him?
Well, I try not to make my future histories wish fulfillment,
Mm,
because if you look at any particular era in human history, um, looking there are going to be people looking back on it who consider it dystopian,
right.
and but for most of the people who are living in it, it's just the way things were, and a lot of them lived happy, normal lives and didn't notice that that their government or their society was something that people hundreds of years or even thousands of years later would consider a nightmarish hellscape. So it's a I try to make my futures realistic, in tune with human nature, and not I don't want to have the people that live in them thinking that they live in the worst of all possible worlds, because most of the people probably do okay, and they complain about their government like everybody else does, but most of them don't conspire to overthrow it because it's a evil dictatorship.
Right. Yeah. There's something to be said for just being present in the moment. And, there's, um, I guess the benefit of hindsight is being able to judge the past based on what you know now. And when you're in the moment, it's just life. It's just the way it is. You just
Exactly.
like everybody else, you're just trying to do the best thing you can at any given moment.
And
When
the only time I may get into a little bit of wish fulfillment is when there's a couple of series where basically present day Earth or near future Earth has the technology of interstellar flight thrust upon it suddenly, and I can't help but do a little, golly gee, silver rocket ship from the '50s wish fulfillment there. But yeah, when it comes to future histories, I try to keep things more grounded.
Speaking of silver rocket ships from the 50s, what was your um what was it that got you into science fiction? Who were some of the authors that, when you're a youngster, that you read that just opened up your imagination? For me, it was Heinlein, primarily, that just
But yeah,
really.
that was me too. I lived in Brandon, Florida, which is a suburb of Tampa, and the library there was pretty well stocked. And I remember checking out the hardback edition of Have Spacesuit Will Travel over and over and over again. The old yellow one with the guy in the purple spacesuit,
Oh, yeah.
and that was the first one. I looked for things similar to that, and I don't know if you've ever heard of a book by a guy named Ted White called "Secret of the Marauder Satellite,"
I think I have.
but that was a Heinlein. It was intended to be a throwback to the Heinlein juveniles. It was written in the mid '60s, I want to say, and um, at the time, I was in the mid '70s, and I was reading the Heinlein juveniles for the first time. So to me, they weren't creatures of the '50s like they actually were. They
Right.
were, they were the first science fiction I was exposed to. So when I read Ted White's um, homage to them, to me it just seemed like more of the same. And after I read all the Heinlein juveniles, I read, Asimov, Clark, Andre Norton, but I ran out of books in that vein because the '50s and '60s ended, and
Right.
that era of science fiction was gone. And it almost turned me off of science fiction, period, because I didn't like at all the stuff that was being put out in the 70s and early 80s. It was very nihilistic and depressing and pessimistic, very philosophical in ways that I didn't like.
Well, I was going to say that, as someone who also grew up in the 70s and 80s, um, I would I would get science fiction that was handed down to me, like from my uncle or from older people in my family, or friends of my parents or whatever. And I would look back at that science fiction and then go to the bookstore and look at what was being sold, like say the mid '80s when I was a teenager,
Mhm.
and just think there, this is not the same thing as this. This is, like they, um, like I didn't leave science fiction. Science fiction left to me is the
That's the
feeling
way I
that I
felt
had.
about it too. I kind
Yeah,
of drifted into fantasy, reading fantasy more at the time because at least fantasy still had kind of a hopeful feel to it.
exactly.
Um, but what got me back into science fiction was cyberpunk. Um, there was a lot of bad cyberpunk, and I
Yeah,
found that out the hard way. But when it was done right, I
William
loved it.
Gibson knockoffs.
Yeah, but William Gibson, the original, Walter John Williams, people like that. Um, when you have a book that is set in an unrelentingly depressing and dystopian future, but that somehow by the end manages to be uplifting and give you hope, then that's like the ultimate achievement. And that's the first books that I wrote. I tried to blend the 1950s style of silver rocket ship, starship, all that stuff with the cyberpunk, with the whole um, one man or a few people against the establishment, against everybody against them,
Right.
achieve achieving victory despite the odds. I tried to blend those together, and that's what really influenced my style of writing science fiction.
Well, we saw that first wave, the silver age, if you will, of science fiction and the silver rocket ships and stuff like you talked about. And then, the next generation was more pessimistic, if you will. And now we're coming back around to there's still some of that pessimistic science fiction out there, but there's
There's a lot
also,
of it,
yeah, but there's
and
also,
unfortunately, it wins a lot of the awards too.
well, yeah, and maybe that's a separate conversation right there, but the whole award structure and publishing. But there's also this upswell of hopeful science fiction again. And do you think that is a trend in publishing, or it's obviously a trend in publishing, but is that caused by a change in the thought process of publishing, or
It definitely is.
it,
Go
it,
ahead. I'm
it
sorry.
but is it because of self-publishing and the rise of small presses like Athon and different
Yeah,
folks
I'd
like
say
that,
definitely
giving a
is.
voice back to people who want something different?
See, the thing is, the market for these stories has always been there. It
Right,
never went away.
right,
Um, what the only thing that changed was the people who were in charge in the traditional publishing houses. I mean, you still have Bain, which is a fairly small traditional publisher that still publishes science fiction and fantasy in the same vein that you and I grew up with.
right.
But for most of the larger houses, there's a disconnect from the fan base. Um, the people who own these companies used to be families, and
Right.
they were rich, obviously, and they lived in New York, but they loved the literature that they were putting out. They had a connection to it. They did this because that was what they loved to do, and their family had been doing it for dozens or hundreds of years or whatever. Probably not hundreds. I mean, books have only been around a certain, but they've been doing it for generations.
Yeah.
Now, the companies are owned publicly. They sell stock. They're not family owned. They've been bought out and bought out and bought out and conglomerated. And the people they've put in charge are the one. There's two like layers of them. The people on top are the ones who just want the profit. And what that means, and that started in the 90s, is they take fewer and fewer chances on new authors. And if they bring new authors in, the advances get lower, the marketing they do for them gets lower, the authors are expected to do more marketing themselves. And that's fine. That's a reality of the economy. But the other side of that is those people who are in charge are not connected to the fan base. And the people they trust to make those decisions are not connected to the fan base either. They're connected to a literary bubble. They know what they like to read, but they all live in New York City. They aren't connected to the average fan of genre fiction. So you had this market that's been out there. I mean, I know that's why I wrote science fiction. That's why I tried to get published, is because nobody was writing what I wanted to read. And come 2011, when the Kindle publishing revolution started, well, it started in 2010, but I jumped in the bag mine in 2011. People started putting out stories like the ones they read when they were kids, and there was a huge market for it. And people made hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of dollars, putting out books, some of which weren't that good, some of which were not well edited, which had bad covers, including mine. But they sold because people were so hungry for that style of fiction. And I mean, now things have kind of reached a tipping point, because there's so many writers out there and so much fiction from small presses and self-published authors that you can't just throw. Like I was reading a Facebook post I put out in November of 2011 when I first put out Duty on Our Planet. I self-published it in like August of 2011, and with no marketing, no ads, a homemade cover, and improper formatting, that book was at number 186 in the whole Kindle store in November of 2011. But you couldn't do that now. No matter how good your book is, no matter how good the word of mouth is, without marketing, without a professional cover, without formatting and editing, you could not do that. But I could do it back then because people were hungry to read what they'd been wanting to read for 20 years and what the traditional publishers hadn't been putting out. And now, I think you would think that the trad pub, industry would learn from that, but it doesn't seem like they do. It seems more like they're stratifying more, that all they learned was online marketing, but they haven't learned that these are the kind of books that there's a market for. I hear all the time in fantasy, people who are in trad publishing or writing articles or writing like recommendations for fantasy writers. Yeah. Well, we want something different. We don't want, a medieval European-based fantasy with elves and dwarves and orcs and dragons. We want something different. We want, Asian-based or South American. And that's all fine. But there's still a market for medieval European-based fantasy with elves and orcs and dragons, and because people buy it all the time.
Right.
And when you say we want something different, they're not. That's the problem with trad pub, is they're not saying we want something different and we want to do the same thing too and just have both. They're saying, no, there's been enough of this. We're going to do something different. But all those people still want to read those stories.
Well, that's something that our friends in romance publishing have learned. You talk to any romance author that is successful, there are and our romance listeners are going to skewer me for this, but there are like five different kinds of romance stories, and there's the enemies to lovers, there's the meet cute, there and several others, and they all
I haven't
sort
seen
of
I haven't seen the
there's
lovers to enemies one. Is that a thing?
that might not be a romance then. I don't know.
Okay.
Um, it- but yeah, but there are certain tropes, there are certain story elements that readers expect, and you deliver those things, and you just find a new way to tell those same kinds of things. So when you say that, a publisher says, well, people don't want this anymore, and you're saying, yes, they do. You just need to find a new and innovative way to meet those reader expectations,
Well, and that's the thing. When it came
without throwing
to
the baby out with the bathwater.
science fiction and fantasy, when the self-publishing boom hit, these weren't even new ways of telling those stories. A lot of them were just retelling the same old stories in the same old ways.
Right.
People want to read those same old stories in the same old ways too. I mean, they want you to do something new with it. They prefer that you had a new spin on it. But if you don't, they still want to read it because this is what they like to read. That's what Trad Pub doesn't seem to get. Most of them, like I said, Bane's different. There's probably a couple others, smaller publishers, but the big guys, they don't get that people want to read what they want to read. They don't want you to tell them what they should read.
So you put that first book out, it went bonkers sales wise, and you realized, oh my goodness, I might have done something that I wasn't prepared for. When did your life change? When did you go from a guy who writes as a hobby and publishes to um, it looks like I'm going to be a full-time author now? And like, when did that changeover happen? And was there a change in your mindset as far as, okay, this is what my daily routine needs to be to maintain the sort of habits that I've put into place?
Well, when I first put out Birthright and Duty, Honor, Planet, those were the two books that I had written intending to get them trad published back in the mid to late 90s. I had an agent. She shopped them around, did not get picked up. And I was pretty like ready to just give up. I mean, I kept trying to write, but I never had like the incentive to finish anything because those seemed to me like the best I could do, and they didn't get picked up.
Pause there for just a second. I don't know your sales numbers, but I'm hundreds of thousands of books you have sold, if not more. And you couldn't find anyone to publish those first books, and thousands upon thousands upon thousands of readers have found those now and connected with them. That tells you right there the disconnect in publishing. So
I mean,
sorry for
I
that
I
sidebar.
don't I don't know for sure that they made the wrong decision because they're thinking of it as I mean, especially back in the late 90s.
Yeah,
They were thinking of it purely from business. Basically, in the late 90s, early 2000s, to break into science fiction or any genre publishing, really, uh, you had to really catch somebody's eye, find somebody who would read your book, or you had to have short stories published and somebody noticed you, and then usually they would ask you to write something in a established franchise like
right.
Star Wars or Star Trek, that type of thing. Um, but anyway, I had given up on being published. I still wrote, but like I said, I had a hard drive full of 20,000 word or 30,000 word fragments of novels because when we got to the muddy middle, I just stopped. Um, so when I published in 2011 those two books, um, I sold, I want to say something like 30,000 copies of those two books in the first like couple months that they came
Wow.
out. And this was not a lot of money because I didn't know what I was doing. I priced them both at 99 cents. But I made in half a year, I made like over $10,000 on those two books. So I was like, I wasn't thinking, oh, this is a career. I was not
Right.
thinking that.
It's a
but
very
I
successful hobby at this point.
that I was thinking this is something I can make. This is a side gig. I can make some extra money. I should write more books.
Yeah.
So I figured that the best thing to do would be to write more books in those two series. Since everybody kept asking, when's the next book in this series? So I wrote two more books in Duty on Our Planet. And because I was still thinking like a traditional author, and because I was a pantser, it took a year each to write those two books. And it took nearly a year to write the two books to finish off the Birthright trilogy. And I was making, just a few $1,000s a year because I was putting out a book a year. I was not marketing at all. My covers sucked. I didn't know anything I was doing. And at the time, I mean, I'm sure there were blogs out there,
Yeah.
but there wasn't the kind of support system there is now
Sure.
for self-published authors. So I didn't know what I was doing. I was making a few thousand a year, which seemed to be enough to pay for me sitting around for, an hour a day, putting out a couple hundred words. Then in 2016, I put out Enemy of My Enemy, the third book in that Birthright trilogy.
Yeah.
And the main character in that trilogy had been in a war before the trilogy started. And I had originally planned to write the book of that war first, but I stopped back when I was trying to get published, figuring that the aftermath of that war was a more interesting story. But I had all these little excerpts and snippets and stories that I told about his experience in the war from those three books. And I said, I need to just write that book because I've got it all plotted out. I know how it happens from beginning to end. And it was like 120,000 word book. It took me 3 months to write, which, was a lot shorter time because I outlined everything. I had to. It wasn't like I wanted to become an outliner. It was that I had to do it right because I'd already told part of the story before and I had to make sure I didn't contradict myself. So I put that book out in the end of 2016. And in January of 2017, from the benefit of that book and the collected trilogy, mostly, and Duty on Our Planet was also up, I made like $28,000 in a month. And I'm like, I should probably write more books. And so I started outlining because it seemed to me that if I put books out, quicker, that there was people who wanted to read them quicker. So I started outlining. I started writing. I think in 2017 I wrote 8 books in that 1 year, when the most I'd ever written before in 1 year was 2. That was the year before. And then from that point on, I pretty much have been a full-time writer. I mean, I kept my day job for a couple more years, but it was the money I made from that was dwarfed by what I made from writing. So I kind of kept it just I got a habit.
Right, right. We're doing a writing challenge right now, the write a novel in 60 days with Dabble. And we're because next month is NaNoWriMo, National Novel Writing Month, where you write 50,000 words in 30 days. It's a challenge to prove to people that they can write a novel in a compressed amount of time. And then we're doing the 30 days prior to that to work on planning and trying to kind of solidify the idea that planning your work ahead of time will make the writing go easier. In that transition for you going from a pantser to a plotter, planner, there most people are very hesitant to switch over, because and there's so many
Oh, I
reasons
was.
why. Yeah, it probably goes back to middle school English, and having to write out outlines, and how excruciating that was, and nobody liked it, and it taking that mindset and bring it into your creative life just doesn't seem to jibe. Um, but when you went through that conversion process, to dip back to your Baptist dad's vernacular there, when you were converted over to a plotter, what were some of the hurdles that you had to get over to switching the way you think about stories?
Well, um, it wasn't exactly a hurdle. Um, I did not. I was very hesitant to become an outliner because I had so much fun pantsing. For
Yeah,
me, pantsing a novel was almost like reading a novel written by somebody else, or watching a movie happening in front of my eyes, because there were so many times in both of those first two series that I pants that things would happen and I'm like, holy crap, I didn't see that coming. It just, I mean, seriously, I
yeah.
I wrote it and I'm like, oh, that can't be right, can it? Like, yeah, this is the only way it could be. I just let the characters guide it, and that's fun. It's a lot of fun, but I knew I couldn't keep doing that. I pretty much knew that if I wanted to make a living at this, that I could not take months to write a book. And the only way that I knew to shorten the process was to outline thoroughly. So there really was no hurdle at that point. It's not like oh, I don't want to do this. I'm going to have to. No, I just like, if this is, I'd always wanted to make a living writing. And pretty much I knew that if I wanted to, this was how I was going to have to do it. So I just did it. I guess that's kind of a mercenary attitude to take, but I did it. I outlined because that's where the money was. That's how I could make money, was by outlining.
Well, either mercenary, or just being a realist.
Yeah.
That's just the fact of, if you're, I mean, not everyone is Stephen King and can, just push through the murky middle when you have no idea what's going to happen.
Well, that's why Stephen King has such crappy endings.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh,
To the point that does a cameo in that last It movie where he talks about his endings that
yeah.
don't stick, which was hilarious that he was
I've
self-aware
only
enough to.
I've only finished two Stephen King novels,
Yeah.
and both of them I was just enraptured by how good the writing was. And then I got to the end and I'm like, oh, that can't be the end. I mean, the worst offender for me is The Stand.
Yeah.
Literally, not even a figure, a literal Deus ex machina. The hand of God reaches down and sets off a nuclear weapon. That's how you end the book.
Yeah. That's when you're just tired of writing. And
Exactly. Yeah.
you're like, well, I'm just gonna wrap this up. Oh man. Rick, what does a typical day look like for you? What's your writing life like? I know you have a schedule with, a production schedule that you have to meet. So what does that look like in practical application?
I don't know if I'd recommend my method to anybody else because it's very, very haphazard. Um, and I can get away with it because my kids are grown and I don't have an outside job. So I pretty much can sit here and do what I want all day long and wake up when I want. But for me, I get up and usually I cannot start my brain working on writing until sometime around lunch. I mean, I will do administrative stuff before that. I will do, emails and everything else that I need to do for the business side of it. But I can't really get creative until I've really woken my head up. I wake up usually around 7:30 or 8 o'clock, and sometimes a little earlier if my dog wakes me up, which he did this morning. Uh, but I can't really get my head wrapped around the work until about noon. Um, I will write, depending on how many things I'm working on at once. Like right now, I'm only working on one book, which is not usual for me. But I have a schedule, and I had to get a certain number of books done by the end of the year, and I have 2 left. So the one I'm working on right now is book 11 in the Drop Trooper series, and I am so familiar with those characters and the setting and everything that's going to happen that it was very easy for me to write a more truncated outline than usual and be able to just fill it in. But to do that, I have to just concentrate on this one book, because the other book that I have to finish is in a new series, and I haven't decided on some of what's going to happen, and it's going to take a lot of time for me to sit down and outline it. So rather than write an outline for Drop Trooper and then write an outline for this other book and then try to jump in on both of them, I'm like, I know I can write Drop Trooper 11 faster if I just do it. So I'm only writing 3,000 words a day, which I usually do 4. I usually do 2 books, 2,000 words in each. But since I'm only doing 3,000 words, I will write 1,000 words between lunchtime and about 3. And then I will go to the gym, come back, eat dinner, and write 2,000 more before I go to bed, which usually winds up being 11:30 or 12, or 12:30 last night. But that's, like I said, that's just because I have no other commitments. I don't have to go to my kids' soccer practice or, do all this other stuff that a lot of people do have to do. But since I have this situation, I'm taking advantage of it.
Heck yeah.
But if I'm working on 2 books at the same time, what I will do is I will try to get started probably about 9 or 10, and I'll get 2,000 words written on one book before 3 o'clock when I go to the gym. And then after dinner, I'll work on the other book, 2,000 on that one.
Drop Trooper aside, because that's a special circumstance. But on a typical book, what do your outlines look like? How detailed do your outlines get?
They're very detailed. I usually wind up writing for 100,000 word book, maybe a 15,000 word outline.
Oh wow!
So basically, what my outline is almost a really, really rough first draft with no dialogue. I do what's called, a version of what's called fat outlining, what for me I do is the first thing I start out with is I will write a detailed synopsis of the plot, basically just telling the story of what happens. This happens, then this happens, beginning to end.
So like if you were sitting down with a friend telling them
Right.
about this book, this would be kind of the dump that you would give a friend.
Exactly. And I will take that dump and I will split it into sentences, or sometimes 2 sentences, and put those in chapters. And then once I have an idea of what's going to happen in each chapter, I'll expand on that. I will tell that same kind of telling a friend thing. I'll do that for each chapter. I'll write like a synopsis of each chapter, and then I will go back, or possibly at the same time, depends on how I feel about it, and put if there's multiple points of view, I'll say this is from this person's point of view. Or there's 2 scenes in a chapter. This one's from this person's point of view. This one's from the other person. I'll say where it happens, what time of day, what's the weather like. Are there any special things in their surroundings that would stick out? Is it cold? Is it hot? Is it raining? Is there some kind of smell? A lot of people forget about smells in books, by the way. I've noticed that a lot. Pardon me. That you're in a situation where you're going to be smelling some really bad things, and people ignore it. And I've been in situations like that. You can't ignore it. It's almost overwhelming. I mean, I've never been in a situation where my life was in danger, but I've been in situations where I had other things that I should have been concentrating on, and something smelled so bad that you can't ignore it. And then that happens in military science fiction. You're in combat. That's all the time in combat. I have a lot of friends who are in combat, and one thing they always mention is the smell. So
Smell is intrinsically tied to memory in ways that no other senses are. Like, you can walk into a room, smell something, and you're instantly transported. My grandfather, for instance, chewed Levi Garrett chewing tobacco, and if I walk in a place and if I smell that, I'm instantly 8 years old again, and I'm completely transported in a way that seeing a work shirt like he wore doesn't, like it can be a memory, but it's not an all-encompassing memory the way smell is. That's a great tip that writers need to focus on that more, because that is something that everyone can relate to.
Another thing um, that gets ignored a lot in science fiction in general, and military science fiction in particular, is music.
Yeah,
And I don't do this as much as I should, but music is a big part of people's lives. And just like with smell, you hear a song, it takes you back. So I'd
exactly.
like to, when I can, when it's possible, just mention the fact that these people are people, and they listen to music, they watch movies, they read books. They're actual people. They don't just pick up a gun and go out and fight and then have no life outside of that.
Right. And that's something that not only military science fiction, but a lot of futuristic science fiction in particular just pretends like that when the 21st century is over, music just ceased to exist. Like
Uh,
it's, and
one,
maybe
one,
it's
one, one
maybe
genre that
nobody wants
does
to chase those trends, or I don't know
one
what.
genre that does attempt to do that somewhat is cyberpunk.
Yeah,
I see a lot of focus on entertainment, music, video games, movies, and
right.
different in cyberpunk. But yeah, a lot of military science fiction. You'd think that these people were robots, that all they
Right,
do is fight and eat and get letters from home.
right. It's so funny. It's so funny. Um, yeah, I guess it's good to check up on your tropes every now and then and make sure that they
But getting
are
back to the,
human.
the outline though, that's the kind of thing that I'll put in. And I will, if I think of any special lines of dialogue that should be put in that chapter, I'll do
Yeah.
that. And by the end, you've got sometimes as much as a page per chapter, but usually about a half a page, maybe three quarters of a page. So it works out to a really, really big outline. And oddly enough, the writing of the outline itself is almost enough that I don't have to look at it while I'm writing the book. I mean, sometimes I have to go back and get a look at you know the circumstances of something, but pretty much the story itself I will already know without even looking at the outline. I'll know where I am and what I have to do just from the writing of it.
You have several series that are numerous books. When you're looking at a series, how do you tell as the writer, this series has more life in it? I could tell another book or two or three books. And then how do you look at a series and think, this one's done? I've got nothing left to say, or the characters have nowhere left to go, or readers are sick of this particular scenario. Like, how do you know when a series has reached its expiration date?
um, I don't want to sound too cold-hearted and harsh, but pretty much if it stops selling, and then I stop writing it, and if it's still selling, then I keep writing it.
Well, I mean, that can sound callous and harsh if you want to, but that is a very real, um, uh, that is uh, a measure of whether it's connecting with readers or not. If it's not
It is.
selling, then no one's reading it, and if no one's reading it, then why are you writing it?
And pretty much, I have found uh, that you can bring new life to any story if there's an incentive for you to keep writing it, and you can end any story not anywhere, but like within 3 to 4 books for certain, you can end any series and end it in a satisfying way. But it's a question of return on investment, because I spend a lot of time each day writing, and when you think of the amount of money the average book makes, I mean, I've been lucky; some might have done pretty well, but in the return on investment of the average book is not very much as far as what you're being paid per hour.
Right. Right.
So
So you have to think of it in
yeah,
terms of a lifelong product that could keep
but I mean,
returning.
if you're writing because it's what you love to do, and you don't really care about the money, if you have another job, this is a hobby, that's great. If it was a side gig, that's awesome. And I mean, it's great being able to do that, but I'm not rich, and
Yeah.
I'm making a living at this, so I have to think about, there's stories that I want to tell. Can I tell them in this series with these characters? And if I can, and people are reading this series but not this other series, then I can keep telling those stories with these characters and tell them just as well.
Well, we'll wrap up with this question, but when you think in terms like that, for whatever reason, writing has this attachment to it where some people are like, this is an art form, and you should write for the art of it, and then the practical reality is, well, I'm a human being who needs a place to live and food to eat, and and writing is a way that I can provide those things for myself and for my family. um th- those two camps are not as you can do both, is what I'm saying. Do you ever have these thoughts of art versus commerce, or is that just a silly argument that is only made by people who have academic jobs and don't have to worry about
There's
paying
two
the bill?
types. There's two types of people who concern themselves with whether their writing is art enough, and that's people who already have a successful writing career
Yeah.
and contracts, and don't have to worry about whether their book's going to sell because they already have the advances, and those who will never make any money at it.
Mm,
You you can put your art into what you write, but the most important thing for what you write is not your art or your loyalty to your art. It is writing something that people want to read. People don't necessarily want to read your art. You may want to write your art, and I understand that, but that doesn't mean there's a market for it.
right. Right.
And I have seen so many writers talk about art, and it always seems to fall in one of those two categories: the people that were already successful, and that's a very incredibly small percentage of those who write for art's sake and are that concerned with art. There's a tiny sliver of a percentage of them that are successful, and the rest never will be.
Well, speaking of commerce, what's your next release? You've got one coming out next week. What is that?
I have the relaunch of book 4 in the Birthright. Well, it used to be the Birthright trilogy, and then when Athon decided to relaunch it, they put Glory Boy in his book 1 instead of a
Mm.
prequel, which made sense. I had thought about doing that myself, never got around to it. So now it's a 4-book series, and Enemy of My Enemy is the 4th book, and it will be coming out Tuesday. After that, I believe the next one to come out is book 2 in the Gates of Eternity series, which is a new one.
Gates
Uh,
of Hope.
Gates of Eternity is the
Oop, whoop. We lost Rick. Let's see if we can get him to reconnect here. Sorry about that, folks. Well, as Rick was saying, Gates of Hope comes out November 8th. It is the second book in the Gates of Eternity uh, series. Oh, here's Rick. Hey, there you are, Rick. I was just
Gates,
telling folks that Gates of Hope is the name of that book, right?
Gates of Hope comes out November 8th. And that is, those are the next two I have coming out. And then Earth at War Book 6 should be coming out sometime next month. It's kind of up in the air. It was originally scheduled to come out in December, but it's done. So,
Is it Allied Powers?
yes.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, Rick, always a pleasure to hang out and to catch up. An inspiration to the writing community, and we love what you're doing. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Hank. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. And Amazon, we'll put a link where all of your books, we can locate it there. But is there a website where if people want to, you have sorted out by series and all of that sort of stuff?
First, on my Amazon author page, by the way, I have a suggested reading order.
Okay.
So a lot of people ask me about that. It is right there.
Yeah, that's what I was asking about.
My
like
Amazon author page.
Where do you jump into the Partlow verse?
I also have a author blog, which is rickpartlow.com. Rarely post there, unfortunately. I also have a author Facebook page, which is facebook.com/Duty Honor Planet. And that's the best place to contact me. I check it regularly. People can message me there. The blog, I post there every once in a great while. So
awesome. Well, we'll post links up to the Amazon page and to the reading order. I'll try to drop it in the YouTube description here later, and then Friday we'll probably release this as an audio podcast, and we'll be sure to put it there.
Also, well. if you were interested in being kept up to date on all my new releases, I do have a newsletter, and there's a link to that. I think there might be one in my Amazon author page description, but there's definitely one on facebook.com/Duty Honor Planet.
I was just looking to see if I could. Yeah, there is one on your Amazon page as well.
Okay.
So awesome. We'll be sure to put that in the notes as well. Rick, always a pleasure. Thank you, buddy.
Thank you, Hank.